Okay, if you take your seats, I think we'll make a start. Okay, my name's Malcolm Campbell from Sweden. Despite my accent, I'm from Sweden. And it's my pleasure to chair this session. To some extent, I've no idea what people are going to talk about. I only chose to chair this session because the titles looked interesting. Right, firstly, a reminder, some people, maybe not the majority, but some people are not native English speakers. So I think it's always useful to remind people that we need to take account of that, avoid speaking quickly, avoid using colloquialisms to try to make it as easy as possible for people to follow. And if you aren't an English speaker, we will have sort of tolerance to the fact that it does take a little bit longer to formulate a question, so don't be shy. We're all friends here. We're going to have 3 sessions. Each session is they have about 20 minutes to talk, and then there's about 10 minutes question time, and then at the end there's 15 minutes dedicated to a panel discussion. The talks, I think we want to be reasonably rigid to 20 minutes. The questions and the panel session, we can be a bit more fluid, and we'll see how it goes there. But I will finish on time. Otherwise, we'll miss the drinks. Okay, so we'll start off with Eric Ranson. If you've read the bio, you'll see that he is a consulting actuary, financial markets dealer, investment banker, treasurer, fund manager, and entrepreneur. I didn't really believe it, so I went onto LinkedIn, and in actual fact, it's true. He's obviously a man of many talents. So, Eric, please.
I think it's fair to say that I'm not all of those things at the same time, but I did enjoy a number of careers as a fund manager and treasurer, and in the old days an actuary. Let's see if I can work this. Okay. Seems to work. Thank you everybody for coming along. I was going to start with a little story. Long time ago, Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, promoted a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that we're really struggling on that for the people side of it. So in this discussion, I wanted to suggest that government could make people's lives better and actually make money while they were doing it. Yeah, until this morning, most of my talk was justification for where I was going, but I've kind of realised that I'm going to have to try and skip all of the justification and just get to the ideas that I want to kind of throw around so that you can tear them apart later. So this is some of my justification. I guess to start with, Winston Churchill thought that democracies were the worst form of government, except for everything else. So I'm still going with democracy, but I'm starting to worry about some of my other cultural biases, free markets and private sector. But anyway, we can see how that works out later. Yes, so I'm proposing that we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, which is a quote from Candide, or the optimists from the time of Voltaire. I think we all studied financial services, but I didn't think I really understood financial services until I went to the University of Life. And I think financial services have got some serious problems. The problem of conflict of interest, I think we're all pretty aware of, and governments are dealing with it or trying to deal with it through regulation and stuff. I'm not sure how successfully, but I wanted to talk about a different problem, and that's living with inflation. Sorry about this graph and the colours. This is my living with inflation graph. So I'll just take you through it quickly because I've got a pointer. And it'll come back into play later on. But yeah, basically what I was trying to show in this graph is that we all earn income between our 20s and our 60s. And the idea is that during that period we save up enough for retirement and we pay off a house or buy a house and pay it off. And we cover all our other stuff so that we can retire without working through to our 90s or whatever. So during that period, typically inflation takes our earnings up, and I've put here net salary just because I've taken out retirement contributions, which generally are, at least in Australia, a fixed proportion of your salary. So basically, salaries are inflation linked, your retirement contributions are inflation linked, and I've put that in blue for the same reason I put insurance in blue, because typically insurance premiums are inflation linked and insurance covers inflation linked. So I'm good with that. I'm not so good with some of these other things here, because when you put your retirement savings into a savings plan, everything's based on absolute returns and the best returns and all that sort of stuff. So suddenly it's not so much inflation linked, but I've left it in green there because the wealth management industry tries to tell you that at the same time as they've got a better return than the other person and they've got a 9% return for the last 10 years or whatever it is, they're also investing to try and get you a real return, apparently. And the yellow for mortgages and cash is because they're basically just done in pure dollars. So that means in America you have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage generally. In Australia we have a 30-year variable rate mortgage, but if interest rates don't change then the variable rate or the repayments potentially just stay level for 30 years. So the interesting thing out of this graph for me, because I'm going to get to mortgages down the track, is that the red line is just basically your discretionary income, which is what's left after you've got your net earnings less your expenses, and being housing expenses and other expenses going up with inflation. So it's just these mortgages that are causing this red line to get pretty low at the start. But if you look at the red line and basically take a measurement or an estimate of the area under the red line, it's actually quite good. If this is Joe average, in Australia they earn 80 grand, so 90 grand, so 80 grand after retirement contributions. If you look at Joe average, if he was a tech company, he'd have a huge value because of this big or high red line at the end. Can you guys see the graph? Good. But because he's just negative today, he can't get a mortgage. So we'll come back to that. I was originally thinking that I needed to get in this slide just in case I talked too much and didn't get to the end of covering things. But basically, yeah, this is where we're going. I reckon we need more inflation-linked assets and liabilities, need government to move from spending to investing, and I want governments to provide basic products that help people live a better life and to make money from it. So, politics is economics and stories. Has anyone read the Modern Monetary Theory story or book? Not many. I read it. I struggled to find much more than was written up there. But at least that's my summary. It felt like it was a bit repetitive. But I mean, the basic points I think were good. That potentially, you could provide things like universal incomes or socially beneficial services, because governments basically control their currency and have the ability to keep spending. The only problem I've got with it is that it also says that they shouldn't keep spending to the point where they create inflationary consequences. And in my mind, any spending creates some sort of inflationary pressures. And it was just that modern monetary theory seemed to become popular with in a period when there was sort of low levels of underlying inflation pressure. So, yes, I got onto something which I was calling Euclidean economics, and where he created axioms. And so my first axiom was almost all spending will create some inflationary pressure, and that seemed to make modern monetary theory flawed. So I looked for solutions or alternatives, and came up with the option of replacing spending with investing, and added that you're investing to generate profits. And suddenly I thought modern monetary theory, or what I called real monetary theory, works. And a consequence of real monetary theory is that governments probably should be spending, because they should be creating socially beneficial products and services, and they should be making money when they can, outside of their taxation and other activities, which potentially rolls back into more spending and more socially beneficial services. So remember the thought that we've got a wealth creation fund. It's not the same as a sovereign wealth fund. It's got lower risk and return profile. It's aimed at benefiting society. And basically it's squeezing lazy capital into real equity positions rather than where the sovereign wealth fund basically competes with capital for the real equity positions. In Australia, I get a bit frustrated because most people who've got capital put it into some form of real estate and call it a useful investment. Now we get to the real stuff. The Australian government used to own a bank. It wasn't innovative, but it was very good at taking deposits and had the biggest deposit base in the country. Then some experts came along, told them to sell it, which they did for about a 20th of what it's worth today, probably for what it earns every year these days, but that's what they did. And then, there's a few problems out there, and the government's decided, we've got to guarantee deposits. So now Australia's government guarantees over $1 trillion in deposits held by banks. But because they're guaranteeing those things, they need to regulate banks a bit more, so they spend hundreds of millions a year on regulating them. And all that regulation means forced a lot of consolidation, so there's a lot less competition. Of course, they've got another agency that costs a lot, I don't know how much, to promote competition. But despite doing all that, there's still problems with the banking system, so they spent 50 million or something on a Royal Commission to find out what all the problems were, which meant that they needed more regulation because they needed to regulate the senior employees at these banks. So I'm not so sure that the sale was a success. But anyway, the result is the Government of Australia guarantees over $1 trillion of deposits. And most of the banks put most of that money into 30-year mortgages. You say to me, they can't do that, can they? 30-year assets with at-call deposits? Well, yes, they can, because the government guarantees them liquidity. So the government's giving deposit guarantees on one hand, liquidity guarantees on the other hand. Banks are taking a net margin over 2% and making 20 billion a year. And yes, the government doesn't own a bank anymore. So I think there is some scope for the government to get involved in basic mortgages in some fashion. But as I alluded to earlier, that little blue circle is basically saying no mortgage for you today to Joe Average. And that's a bit of a problem. So my suggestion is to create a real mortgage product where the principal grows with inflation. So now we've got a red line that's much flatter, so there's less space under that red line. I mean, ultimately, if the mortgage has the same profit characteristics, then the space should be the same as under the previous red line, I guess, depending on valuation rates and all the rest of it. But the point simply is that the initial repayments are reduced by 30% on the same mortgage with the same profit characteristics. So to put that into practice, in Australia last year we had more inflation of around 7%. So that would mean that your mortgage repayments would be going up by 7% over the last 12 months. But if you compare it to our variable rate mortgages, when inflation went from 0% or thereabouts to 7%, interest rates on mortgages went from 2% to 5 or 5.5%. So the repayments on ordinary mortgages at 5.5% were 75 or 100% higher than the repayments on the 2% mortgage. So not only do we create a mortgage that's more affordable in a country that's screaming out about mortgage stress and people being unable to pay their mortgage payments, we've also got something that's far more stable. And where it's not stable because of inflation, it's basically matching your growth in earnings, or the likely growth in earnings. Probably an imperfect match, but I'd suggest a lot better than the match between your variable rate mortgage that went up 75% over the last 12 months. Oops, sorry. So the great thing about having a real mortgage instead of a absolute mortgage is that it's got a lower initial payment. And that improves cash flows, which we can talk about here quickly. If you have a $400,000 house in Australia, you'd probably have a rental around $20,000 a year. But with funding it with real capital and perhaps a real mortgage, you might need payments of around $8,000 a year. So that means that potentially a government, my starting point is the rents on residential properties are enough to provide a good return on capital for investors and to pay the mortgages. So if a government's got a lower cost of capital, then the government's pretty well placed to support people into affordable housing, or into ordinary housing, there's no need to call it affordable, that they can afford so like I said, instead of a 20,000 rent, you'd be paying a 4,000 rent. Sorry, confusing myself. Paying 8,000, and you've got the potential of paying 8,000 principal, so you can pay it off over 40 years. That's somebody who normally wouldn't be able to afford a house. Anyway, we're running out of time, so I'll just quickly go through retirement savings. I was trying to talk about that last year, but and get into the complication of portfolio theory and creating efficient frontiers. And my estimates, based on some sort of estimate of what real assets should be producing, was that a normal, an appropriate portfolio for retirement savings might include sort of 33% of the assets that are inflation linked. And yeah, let's simplify that and get out of here quickly. If somebody is retiring at age 67 and needs a real income for the next 30 years, then that'd be a pretty good fit for somebody else who is looking at buying a house and can only pay a certain proportion of their income for the next 30 years. So there's got to be a financial solution, and one day I might make it happen with the company that I've just started, but I shouldn't be doing any promotion in this talk. So I am running out of time, so I just had some quick summaries. But basically, yeah, I can understand why real assets aren't that popular. I mean, they're long-term, they're boring, and they make it hard for wealth managers to compare themselves with everybody else. So, but I mean, you know, terms like a millionaire have lost meaning in my lifetime. It used to be something valuable. Now everybody in Sydney who owns a house is a millionaire. So I mean, even our language is affected by inflation. So if you have assets and liabilities that are all working together with inflation, then I think things will work out better. Time is up. But yes, let's go back to the first point. Governments should be making life better for most people, or for the average person, and making some money doing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. So we've got some time for some questions. There is a mic revolving round. If you'd say your name first and then state your question.
Hi, Eric. My name's Divik. Thanks for the presentation. Had a question around how your principal would be linked to inflation. Have you considered your principal being linked to... Sorry, I had two questions first. Did you consider a principal being linked to wage inflation instead? That will reduce the possibility of like a wage inflation spiral.
I think there's scope for all sorts of different products and different ways of managing basis risk. In the first instance, I'm just focused on let's get the structures right at a really basic level. I think yes, when I put up my my graphic there, basically we had wages inflation going up at the same rate as the cost of living, and that's not always going to be the case. My sense is that most people focus on CPI in Australia, but cost of living as the normal or best indicator of inflation, and so that's my starting point.
All right, and second question is probably just around, if you do link your principal and your interest to inflation, then wouldn't that defeat the power of central banks to control inflation by increasing their cash rate?
I think I love your point. I had thought about making it at some point, but I think as you link more things to inflation, there is less scope for just pure interest rates to have an impact. But I think that's probably a good thing, and it probably transfers a little bit more power back to fiscal policy, which I think might be arguably where it should be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for the talk. It was very good. I think one of the takeouts I get from it is that if the government was going to provide simple, effective financial products, I think you indicated that you might need a supply of inflation-linked assets, and someone has to provide those. And in some countries like the US and the UK, they have inflation-linked government bonds. If the government here were, or in any country, were to have a lot of inflation-linked government bonds, that would give them an incentive to follow policies which control inflation, because they don't want that to get out of control. And in the Australian context, the Australian government already has a large amount of inflation-linked assets in the form of student loans. The student loans are linked to inflation. Yep. They could securitise those and put them into financial products.
Yeah. Well, I think it's this process of writing a paper and getting ready for a conference and actually doing it 6 months later is taking a bit long. So I've got a lot of ideas for a lot of other products, which include just the cash rate. I think there should be a savings product that basically offers you an inflationary return with no tax on it that could be offered by a government, and that could be done in the form of a cryptocurrency or something. But there's all sorts of, I mean, basically companies invest in a factory, and they're expecting an inflation-linked revenue stream out of that. Most people probably should be borrowing on an inflation-linked basis, and as I kind of vaguely alluded to, there's on the other side. Sorry, losing my train of thought. Too old. Investors basically. I mean, I think the term wealth or wealth management should be about managing your real income. So basically, I think all investors should be basically concerned about inflation-adjusted returns as their kind of base starting point.
Okay, we'll draw the questions to a close. There will be an opportunity for more questions at the end, but we need to go on. So thank you very much, Eric.